Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I am your host, Giulia Bottaro, and I'm joined today by my other co-hosts, Felicia Jackson and Heather Dinwoody will join again next week. So today we're going to discuss election, the very big theme of, to be fair, the year, because we know that so many people are voting this year.
I think it's 40% of the world's population is voting this year, and we were all expecting a massive shift to the right, especially after what happened in the European elections. And la-di-da-di-da, didn't happen, at least not in the UK or in France.
Yeah, I think we're very relieved. It's really good. I mean, from our perspective of Shaken Not Burned, the UK voted for a Labour majority, quite a big majority, which is always good in terms of, a stable government over the 5 years. And then the fresh news is that France has elected a left-wing socialist green coalition instead of the far-right party led by Marine Le Pen, which kind of everyone thought would be the winner this time round.
Well, I do think there's a really fascinating thing going on, because what happened in France felt from the outside like there was a shift to the right. Obviously, the French electoral system is very complicated. But when there was a possibility of seeing a right-wing government, voters got together and said, okay, we're worried. There's a cost of living crisis. We don't know what's going to happen next. But instead of going for this sort of fairly authoritarian, blame-driven political framework, and in a world where everything's getting darker and, that there seems to be danger all around and conflict, who wants a government in place that's going to turn on the poor and the weak? Who wants a government in place that blames immigrants for economic problems?
I think everyone else... Basically.
Yes, for you it's very difficult as an Italian, I can imagine.
No, I think I am relieved because I had kind of lost faith in, from this perspective. I just thought, okay, the whole of Europe is going to go that way and we're just going to have to ride this out and hope we get out of it very soon. So obviously I'm a little bit jealous because in Italy we have a very far-right government, voted by a very small percentage of the people, by the way, but that's how it works.
Well, unfortunately, that's what happens a lot. This is what people need to vote.
Yeah, exactly. People need to vote. And I think exactly. That's a problem with Italy, is that there's just a huge percentage of people that don't vote.
It's not just Italy. Let's not forget, well, I know I promised not to bring Brexit up very often. It was, less than half of the country actually voted in the Brexit referendum? You've got small percentages of people making choices.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. No, I think, it is a relief. It definitely is a relief. I think in the UK, we definitely saw this coming. It's not a surprise. People were done with the Tories. It had been 14 years of the Tories in power, and respectfully, it didn't work. But in France, it's been a surprise, and it's been definitely a positive one from our perspective.
Definitely. Well, because from our perspective, we're interested in what can be done to provide solutions to the problems we face, in terms of climate change, in terms of nature destruction. And fundamentally, what I see as the issue with a sort of right-wing agenda is this belief that free markets are the solution to all problems. And I understand how that works if you go back to the beginning of the markets and economics and Adam Smith and this idea that, the individual need to, he was a philosopher by education and by teaching, but he believed that, enlightened self-interest, that self-interest would result in societal benefit overall. It's this idea that the invisible hand will allocate resources in the most efficient way. And that's resulted in this idea of the rational actor will always make the best choice moving forward. But, the rational actor, that idea is what was behind austerity. The idea that if you cut people working for government, the rational actor will recognize that lower government employment will equal lower government spending, which will equal lower taxes, which means they'll have more money in the future. So there's this expectation that an individual will make that rational choice over time, never considering the emotional impact of watching, a third of people employed by the government being out of work, when everyone knows someone who's affected by that loss. Look at what happened to Greece 20 years ago. When austerity measures were introduced, youth unemployment, I think at one point was 70 or 80%. How are you supposed to have a functional society when people are afraid? And that doesn't even get me on to this idea certainly Adam Smith, when he talked about wealth, talked about the production of goods and services. Well, that's akin to GDP today. That's all well and good. But GDP does not address those common goods like clean air and healthy soil and clean water. We've got a government in the UK that over the last 14 years has effectively allowed water companies to dump sewage. Not because they were allowed to, they were regulated against, but the regulator had no teeth. The fines were cheaper than it costs to actually clean the sewage. Well, then you're telling people it's okay to behave that way. And that's something I think that the new government's got to be really aware of. I know it's been really careful and cautious about what it said, because there wasn't much of what the traditional left wing would want in Labour's manifesto. It was very much focused on fiscal responsibility and not having a weak spot for the Conservatives to actually attack. But there does need to be a really hard conversation about how we pay for the problems that have been inherited, because we do have problems in the NHS and in education and in social care and in infrastructure, and they've got to be dealt with. And I don't know what we do without addressing those problems, but it's got to be done in a way that doesn't frighten investors, because in the end, the private sector is where a lot of the money is.
Yeah, I think it will be a challenge for Labour because they want to make everyone happy. So they want to address these challenges that you mentioned. And I think from a climate perspective, there is, certainly the energy transition, oil and gas. They want to insulate homes, which is desperately needed in a country like the UK, sort out the sewage issue, sort out biodiversity, because the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries. But at the same time, as you said, we do need to attract private investment, which, especially after Brexit, has tended to go elsewhere. So, yeah, I hope they make it in 5 years.
Well, I think it will be interesting. There's almost part of me that feels, we all know that a large part of the reason people voted for Labour was that people just thought we can't keep the Tories in. They've literally overseen, I think, 4% GDP growth over 17 years, and the country's fallen apart. I understand that lots of other things have happened. COVID wasn't great. Brexit happened. But why did Brexit happen? Because a Tory politician went, let's have a referendum. There are issues that have been dealt with really badly. But what I see is the fundamental fabric of our society has been ignored. And I mean that not just in terms of infrastructure and energy and insulation, but actually common decency and consideration for others. And as I said, social care and healthcare, because I think it would be foolish to ignore the fact that the free market as an ideology allows companies to exploit resources and destroy nature without having to pay for it. There's a reason that Nicola Stern described climate change as the greatest market failure of all time. Because if you're allowed to make money from exploiting things around you and not have to pay for the consequences of your action, well, of course you're going to make loads of money, but in the end, other people are going to suffer. That's why we see so much wealth accumulating in the hands of so few. The Labour Party has said they plan on addressing the tax status of non-DOMs, which will be interesting. But there's also, what about tax that's already avoided? What is it, 450 billion a year that's avoided in taxes? It's one thing to say you're going to address that and try and get it, but how? And I think that's where the hard conversations have to take place. How are we going to change how we do what we do? What's the message that we're sending out? I don't want to live in a country where immigrants who are leaving places where they can't live because of climate change or conflict get blamed by the culture for services falling apart and for not being able to. That's just not a country I want to live in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one interesting thing about this election is that from a climate perspective, the Green Party has advanced a lot, has gained a lot of votes. It got 4 MPs. And I saw the other day this thing that it got second place in tens of other constituencies. So I think that people really sent a signal here to say we want more climate action. We trust the Green Party. And I think that's really extraordinary.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's not so much perhaps trusting the Green Party, but what I think is utterly fascinating is that message that's being sent that the electorate does think climate change is a problem, that we actually know we have to address the challenges that are coming because of it. People are beginning to understand that, okay, climate change used to be something you would worry about that was happening far away. I'm not even talking about extreme weather in the UK. I'm talking about the fact that the price of chocolate has doubled in 18 months, the price of coffees, because if you can't grow things in places where you used to grow them, it affects the food chain. And that means it affects all of us. So even the most selfish people are going, yeah, but actually it is in my interest to do something about this. And there was a brilliant thing I saw. I think it was the UK Sustainable Investment Forum. They basically did it's UK SIF, they did a public poll. 74% of respondents said they thought that climate change is a threat to global stability. So I think that's really interesting in and of itself, because that's about conflict over resources. 71% said they thought the next government, which is now the Labour government, must do more to protect the climate. And what's really interesting to me, 72% thinks the next government, Labour, needs to seize the economic opportunities of net zero. And I think that's part of the conversation that needs to be had as well, shifting from the sort of danger and destruction and loss and exploitation of climate and nature loss to actually what good can we do? How can we build things differently? How can we invest in ways that benefit society as well? And I had a really interesting conversation last week, which was actually about fiduciary duty. So, often there's these discussions, well, companies can only do what's good for the shareholders. It's in their fiduciary duty to return financial capital to shareholders. But actually, fiduciary duty is your legal duty to behave in an appropriate way and return over time. So perhaps strengthening what that actually means would be one very swift way of changing corporate decision making. Because when you're dealing with the climate and with biodiversity and with nature, you have to think about the long term. And companies are not set up to do that. Individuals are doing their best to do their jobs in a way that the boss likes. And at the board level, it's like, well, if you're a public company, it's what are my next quarter's results going to look like? And if you're a private company, it's usually who's going to get cross with you about what. And if nobody knows, why does it matter?
Yeah, I think we really need a culture shift in this sense. And when you were talking earlier about exploiting, the transition, the net zero transition in a way that benefits everyone, one of the things that Labour want to do is set up a new energy company called Great British Energy. They say it would create 650,000 jobs across the UK. And I imagine they would directly, create these jobs across the country, not just in the usual cities where you always find jobs, because we need...
Well, that's the point. It could be anywhere in the country.
Exactly. Especially because you find wind on the coast. So, really revive coastal areas. And in this, by setting up, and I really like that they don't want to give any more new oil and gas licenses, because they clearly state on their website they don't actually benefit the who pays the bills in the UK. This, and it's so nice that finally someone says it, because I felt it was a bit of, it wasn't quite greenwashing. How do you call it? Bill washing, maybe. Just saying, oh yeah, we'll lower the bills by drilling new oil. And it's like, no, it's not true. Like, stop saying that.
Yeah, exactly. It's where does it go? Who gets the money? Can I just interrupt and tell you a story I read last week, which was about a development with a heat pump. And it's terrible. It was built for residents. Basically, it was meant to be cheap and great, and because you can manage your energy bills more effectively. And their energy bills have gone up about 800%, and everyone's in shock. And it's all, oh yeah, it's the green crap. The reason the bills went up is because the heat pump is powered by gas.
Oh.
And the cost of gas had gone up so much in the interim because they had controlled pricing for a period that's why the price of their power went up. And it's like, it feels like half the time you're only being told part of the story. I'm not saying things aren't complicated, but what I am saying is you have to understand that things are complicated and not stop at that first hurdle and go, okay, so you're telling me this is a problem. Why is it a problem? Why is it so much more expensive to do that way? Sorry to interrupt. I was agreeing with you about bills.
No, it's fine. I think it's all it's all part of the culture shift, the changing the mindset, because people have thought things in a certain way for a long time, and now everything is being revolutionized by climate change. But it's hard to accept this new reality, and I understand when people just want to cling on how things used to be. Unfortunately, it's not like that anymore. So
you can't stick your head in the sand.
Exactly. And you need to be willing to learn. And sometimes people don't even have the tools to research, or they don't have the time, they don't have the ability, like they don't know where to learn the new things. So yeah, I can see why it's so much easier to just blame the green crap. So hopefully a Labour government
Will
and
not do that.
exactly, and the new French government wouldn't do that. And they are very big powers in Europe, so if they get it, if they see things in that way, hopefully that will help.
Definitely. Well, I think what's perhaps most powerful is that climate change and nature destruction are going to bring change to us all, whether we like it or not. Our choice is how we face that change. And one of the things I love about Shaken Not Burned is we're trying to talk to change makers. It's who are making those positive changes, who are finding solutions, who are saying, this is what we can do differently, and this is how we make it work. And so, yeah, no, I'm very excited to be part of it.
Yeah, me too. And I think this is a really nice segue to our break, which will then be followed by the interview of the week.
Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by Carsten Brinkschulte, who's the founder of Dryad Networks. Now, this is an interesting company. I'm sure we all know a little bit about how cities are using data to understand how to more efficiently run traffic and planning and all sorts of different things. But Dryad Networks is actually an environmental Internet of Things startup, and it's actually does something called the Internet of Forests. Carsten, can you explain exactly what that means?
Well, I mean, the Internet of Things, most people will know, is connecting devices, sensors, actuators to the Internet so that you can control things or inspect things remotely. And that works quite well in the home, in the smart home. It works quite well in urban environments to control street lighting or other aspects to measure water meters, connect water meters and other Internet of Things devices. Well, the issue is in the forest, which is what we are targeting, the traditional IoT, the Internet of Things network infrastructure, does not work because the Internet of Things relies on network infrastructure. It relies on telecommunications, either Wi-Fi or LTE or whatever telecommunications network to transport the data. Now, in the forest, there is no mobile network, as you will know when you've been hiking for an hour or two. That's it with your smartphone. And the reason for that is because the mobile operators, they can't seem to find a business case to deploy very expensive mobile network infrastructure in those extremely remote locations where only a few people ever go, and the bears don't really need an internet connection. So what we do is we provide the Internet of Trees. That's what we call it, the IoT. We're creating a digital network infrastructure in the forest, and then we put applications into that network infrastructure, like fire detection.
Excellent. So this is a particularly interesting thing to me because what you're talking about is deploying a system that enables early identification of wildfires. Is that right? Because one of the things I know that I saw some numbers on this, and I think it was in 2023, it was over 4 billion euros in damage just from wildfires.
Well, actually, the numbers are mind-bogglingly high. I recently read a number that in the US alone, last year I think it was $800 billion of financial losses, which comprises of loss of property, loss of business. So it's a combined financial number, but it's huge. The financial impact of it, yes.
That's incredible. So, I mean, one of the things that then obviously is a question to ask is how big are you? You know, how many areas do you actually work in?
Well, we've created this product we call Dryad SilverNet. It's a network for the forest. Silver is like the forest in Latin, and network is the network. So we create this SilverNet network, and we deploy it in forests worldwide to detect fires as early as we possibly can. And we've been working on it for 3 years and started to introduce the product last year. And we've sold it so far to about 50 customers worldwide, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, but also in the United States, and as far as Chile and South Korea. Now we've sold about 20,000 units so far of our wildfire sensor that actually can detect the fires. But this is the first year of sale, so we're expecting a lot more this year and the coming years.
So, who are the clients for a product like this?
The customers are typically private forestry, where obviously the customers need to protect their assets, the timber that they've been growing for 20, 30 years, which is all but at risk within a week of wildfire. Everything can be gone that you've been growing for the last 30, 40 years. Then we have the municipalities, where it's clearly about public safety, protecting people, life and assets effectively, and infrastructure. And then we do have utility companies, power line operators, which have a liability issue if their infrastructure is actually causing a fire, as well as railway operators, where we have a similar issue.
Okay, so that all makes a lot of sense. What I'd like to understand a little bit more about is how this works with solar-powered AI sensing. Because I get that solar power still works in the shade. So, it doesn't actually have to be an issue about it being in bright sunlight. But what exactly do the sensors track, and how is the AI used to understand what's going on the ground?
Well, these sensors are solar powered, as you say, and we use supercapacitors for energy storage because we didn't want to bring fire starters with lithium-ion batteries into the forest. But to answer your question regarding the way they function, we have a gas sensor built into the device. And this gas sensor is detecting hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. And then we use machine learning, or you would say AI, because it's better for marketing terms. We use this AI to actually identify the patterns that the sensor is exposed to, so that we can actually distinguish a wildfire, the smell of a wildfire, from that of a diesel truck driving by. So we use the AI to avoid false positives and to be sure that what the sensor is detecting is actually a wildfire.
And is it just the sensor that's powered by solar, or is the AI, the machine learning work, actually done powered by renewable energy?
Well, actually, the sensor runs the AI at the edge, as you would say. So we actually, unlike most AI systems, which are running on high-powered data centers consuming a lot of energy, which is, I think, a bad aspect, a serious problem of AI. We do not have that problem because we use distributed AI. We actually execute the machine learning code in the sensor, which is of course solar powered and distributed into many sensors on the edge. So we're running a distributed edge computing AI system on the sensors. And for the connectivity, we use these gateways, the solar-powered gateways that actually we're also distributing in the forest that create that Internet of Trees, the IoT network infrastructure, so that the sensors can actually communicate with the internet, and then we obviously send out geolocations of alert to firefighters.
This sounds incredible. And I have to say, the idea that you can actually power the machine learning at the edge is a really exciting step forward when you consider how much information we need about forests, because obviously wildfires are important and that has a knock-on effect on a lot of carbon projects, but there's so much else in nature. Can you tell me a little bit about your vision beyond the Internet of Trees?
Well, right now we're using our solar-powered mesh network infrastructure in Silvernet, predominantly, obviously, to provide an infrastructure for the wildfire sensors that we're going to market with. But once you have the network infrastructure deployed in the forest, it's a generic IoT infrastructure, and it can be used for many applications that make sense from a scientific or commercial perspective. And we've started to work on additional sensors that we want to introduce over the next few years. First being soil moisture or fuel moisture sensors to determine the fire risk by measuring the moisture that's stored in the gravel or the leaves and the needles lying on the ground, the fuel that actually starts a fire typically. We're also interested in planning to work on subflow sensors, tree growth sensors, or a chainsaw detection or gunshot detection device. All of these would be additional applications that you can actually build once there is a digital network infrastructure in place. And that's the fundamental enabler that Dryad is providing, the Silvernet network infrastructure. Once that is in place, we can put many more applications on top of it.
So, for example, if there was an Internet of Trees out there in protected land and illegal loggers came onto it, you'd be able to detect that was happening?
Absolutely. Illegal logging is a substantial problem for many timber companies, in particular in emerging markets. You see a lot of theft. A tree is quite expensive. An oak tree can be worth 50,000 euro if it's fully grown. So stealing it makes a lot of sense, and protecting your property obviously as well. So if we maybe in a year from now have a sensor that can listen to the sound of a chainsaw, and we can alert the owner of a forestry. If that happens at 2 a.m. at night, it's probably somebody trying to steal your timber.
And that's definitely something that most asset owners would want to prevent. Now, I saw that you raised, was it 5.6 million euros earlier this year in order to accelerate the business? What are you planning on doing with that?
Well, I mean, the company is still in startup mode, so we're still requiring capital to grow and fund the business while we're scaling our operations and scaling the sales. So we're now 48 people here in Berlin, Germany, and we've 33 engineers. Now we're starting to build our sales and marketing team to actually go out and bring the product as quickly as possible to as many forests as we possibly can, to have the positive impact that we're actually seeking with the company, because we are an impact for profit. So the main mission of the business is to have an environmental impact by preventing the environmental damage that wildfires are causing to the climate and to biodiversity. But we also want to be profitable. And in order to achieve both, we need to scale as quickly as possible, which is what we're using this funding for.
And what sort of ingredients do you think there need to be in place to see your solution scale? Because obviously capital is one part of it. But at the same time, it's appetite, it's regulation. What are the things you would like to see in place? For example, I know that the EU's nature restoration law would have perhaps driven a lot of interest in forest protection and recovery. What are the things you'd like to see?
Well, that is one of the things that we'd like to see come into reality, and we're quite disappointed to see that stalled or paused effectively. So that's definitely something which we would benefit from, and not just Dryad. I think an entire economic ecosystem would benefit from that, which would in turn help nature a lot, and then humanity in the end. So regulation is clearly a key aspect because regulation drives funding, and funding is required because most businesses cannot work on charity. And if you need a business model to build a company that can scale, and that means you need customers willing to pay. And if there is regulation that requires or channels funds into companies indirectly like Dryad, then that definitely something we'd be interested in. Also, we'd be very interested to finally see a business model and a business case for biodiversity credits. We see a huge potential in that, for example, in measuring the effects of biodiversity and quantifying biodiversity with IoT. That's something which we would like to do. But in order to do that technically is one thing, but in order to do it technically and then profitably is another thing. So enabling a business model for biodiversity credits, that I think would unlock a lot of applications.
Now, that's a really interesting point you bring up, because obviously I've read a great deal about the potential for biodiversity credits, but there is that issue of, can one area of biodiversity be offset against another? So is it biodiversity credits? Is it biodiversity units? Do you have a particular position on it? I'm just interested because you have a forest perspective.
It's a very valid question, and I unfortunately do not have an answer or a valid opinion on it. I'm just looking at it, to be honest, from a business perspective. We would be interested in creating sensors that would be able to measure and quantify biodiversity, and so we'd be providing the tools for others to apply, but others would apply this tool only, I assume, at scale, if there is a valid business case for them to do it so. So biodiversity credits, no matter how they're being structured or measured, would enable applications like we would like to develop.
Yeah, so you have the skill set to create the edge network computing to track through the different sensors that you use, whatever it is the market decides they actually want to do with it.
Exactly. So if there is a business case, then we can provide the technology. And we're quite interested in obviously the technology, but we need to do it and the impact, but we need to do it profitably. So the business case can only work if there is a financial incentive for customers to do so.
Yeah, well, that's the fundamental underpinnings of the global net zero transition, is we need to have a framework that drives action in a different way. Well, it's been fascinating listening to you, Carsten. I'm going to ask you my favourite question, which is I like to end on. What haven't I asked you about that you think I should have done, or that the audience needs to know about Dryad?
Well, I guess a question that always is being asked is, why don't you simply use satellites for the stuff that you do? And obviously we feel that sensors and terrestrial networks is the right thing to do, because you need ground truthing of data. Not everything can be seen from above. The tree canopy acts like a blanket. Most of the things that are happening under the tree canopy are barely visible to satellites or drones, for that matter. So we feel it's very important that we connect the trees and the ecosystem underneath the trees with ground truthing sensors. They're faster in detecting fires. They can see things and measure things that cannot be easily measured. And even if they're combined, which I think it makes a lot of sense to combine sensors and satellites, you still need the ground truthing for the sensors to provide, enabling the satellites to extrapolate that over larger areas.
And that certainly makes a great deal of sense, especially considering the resolution that you can get with some satellites. And of course, the fact that without Silvernet, we wouldn't have your Internet of Trees. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Carsten. I really appreciate it. For our audience, I hope you enjoyed learning about the Internet of Trees, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts.